Committee meeting for the OWEB Water Acquisition Grant Program. I may have started a little too soon. So sorry, Meg, if the intro was cut off a bit. So thanks to everyone for joining today. We've got great turnout of RAC members. We'll do introductions soon, and it looks like we have several interested members of the public joining too. So let's kick it off with introductions. I'll start with RAC members as they're appearing on my team's screen. So, and I'll kick it off at Renee Davis, Acquisition Special Programs Manager at OWEB. I'll go next to Spencer.
Hello all, Spencer Swaski. I'm the Habitat Division Deputy Administrator at ODFW, and I also manage the water program. Happy to finally get in the meeting.
Thanks, Spencer. Thanks for your patience. Jessica, we'll go to you next.
Sure. Good afternoon. Jessica Humphreys. I'm the Oregon Flow Restoration Director for Trout Unlimited.
Thanks, Jess. Corey.
Good afternoon. Corey Kershane, Water Resources Department, Allocation of Conserved Water Program Coordinator.
Thanks, Corey. Kate.
Good afternoon, Kate Fitzpatrick, Executive Director of the Deschutes River Conservancy.
Thanks, Kate. Kaylin.
Good afternoon, Kaylin Barter of Counsel with Culp and Kelly LLP, and here on behalf of Environmental Defense Fund.
Thanks, Kaylin. Steve.
Hi, everybody. Steve Perrette with the Water Integration Team at your Department of Environmental Quality.
Thank you. And Anton, good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to finally be here. I'm Anton Kiono. I work for the Department of Natural Resources for the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation.
Thanks, Anton. And I don't think, Meg, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that we've had Shyla or April join yet.
I don't
Correct?
believe so.
Okay. Okay, so we may see Shyla join in a bit. We're not certain, and not certain about April's attendance today. It is, this overlaps with legislative days at the Capitol, so April may be otherwise occupied. But if they join, we'll ask them to introduce themselves. So let's switch over to introductions for OWEB staff. So Brian, we'll go to you.
Good afternoon, Brian Walcott, Water Acquisition Program Coordinator and Capacity Grants Coordinator.
Great. Meg.
Hi folks, my name is Meg Birchfield. I'm with OWEB. I'm a grant support specialist, and I'm here doing just kind of administrative technical stuff in the background. If you need anything, just let me know.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And Meg, just thank you for everything. Brian and I
Happy
would
to
be
help.
fumbling through this. Definitely. Taylor, go ahead.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Taylor Larson. I'm the coordinator for the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program here at OWEB, and here to support, share my screen once we start getting into the rulemaking editing.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. Taylor does not give himself enough credit for the great note taking that he's been doing, as you all are throwing really good ideas at us for rule revision. So thanks, Taylor. And Eric Hartstein.
Good afternoon, everybody. Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator at OWEB.
All right. And then let me do just a quick overview for the day, and then I'll turn it over to Eric for public comment. And what we may want to do is just have any non-RAC or OWEB folks who are on the call go ahead and introduce themselves to the degree that you're interested in doing that once we turn it over into public comment space. So in terms of the plan for the day, we'll next do public comment, and we've gotten both some written public comment that Eric will walk you through, and then we may have some verbal public comment, which is wonderful. And then our hope for the day is to make it through the entirety of a walkthrough of the full rule set. So we will start off with the first hour focused on reviewing edits we've made thus far through the sections of the rules that we've gotten through. So that goes through section 0196. Within that time frame, we will hold some time. There were several substantive issues that have come up over the course of the first few RAC meetings. So as we kind of get to a logical place to kind of pause in terms of the nuts and bolts rules walkthrough, and just spend a little bit of time talking about some of these meatier issues. We definitely want to hold space for that. I will, though, try to encourage us to transition into continuing through the second half, or well, probably about second one or one final 1/3 of the rule set, so that we can do a complete walkthrough. And as we see where we land at the end of the day, I think we'll have a better sense of, are we looking at one more Rules Advisory Committee meeting? Might we need 2 more? We definitely want to spend the time needed to do a deeper dive into some of these substantive issues, given that we typically only do rulemaking once every 5 years. So it's important to get key topics on the table. So that's the plan for the day. It looks like maybe we had April join. April, are you with us? All right, I see April, but she's not unmuting. So April's
I'm just
now...
allowing the mic for the
Oh,
phone
perfect.
number that just
Okay.
joined.
Okay, we'll hold tight for a second.
Great.
April, are you able to hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. It told me I had to unmute myself. Apologize, I am on the road and had some difficulties joining, but am listening in and will probably be muted for the duration of the call.
Okay, thanks for joining us, April. April's with the Oregon Water Resources Congress and is a member of the RAC. And April, we're happy to follow up, given that you're driving, so we want you to be safe. Okay, so I think with that, Eric Hartstein, I'll turn it over to you for public comment.
Great, thanks, Renee. So we did have, we have had one public comment received for this particular RAC meeting. We also had a comment that came in prior to the last RAC meeting. Due to a technical issue, we weren't able to get that received in time for the meeting. So we sent both out to the RAC members yesterday, and they're also both posted on our website. The comments that were received in advance of the second RAC meeting were from Water Watch, and then Ken Beerley submitted written comments ahead of this meeting. So I think for both of those written comments, we'll be getting into some of the meat of them during the walkthrough that Renee mentioned. But I also want to save time here for any verbal public comments. So for those that are here that would like to provide verbal comment, can you please raise your hand? Okay, I see Ken, you have your hand raised. And so ask Meg if you can maybe unmute and make sure that we can hear from Ken.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. As you can tell, I'm retired, so you have a 7-page epistle from me. But I wanted to make the argument that including groundwater under certain conditions seems to be very appropriate for water acquisition. While there is no corollary or parallel with the conserved water statutes for surface water, under certain conditions when a basin is closed and there is a direct connection between groundwater dependent ecosystems and an individual water right, it seems like there should be at least serious consideration given to acquiring that water right for the purposes of maintaining and enhancing groundwater dependent ecosystems. So I've suggested specific language for the rules on page 6, but the fundamental argument is that it's easy to regulate surface water because you can see it. It's harder to deal with groundwater. We don't have parallel structures in law to protect groundwater other than through something like a critical groundwater management area. or closed basins. But for example, in the Klamath Basin, Water Resources Department made a determination that any well within 500 feet of a gaining reach had a significant effect on stream flow. Those kinds of things, there should be the opportunity to consider acquiring those groundwater rights as long as there isn't the opportunity to drill other wells. And you can see that there is a direct benefit between the water right acquisition and ecological benefit. And it's easy to ignore groundwater because it's not seen, but it's critically important, a part of the hydrologic cycle. We like to focus on the surface portion, but the groundwater portion is particularly important. And ways to provide opportunities to protect that resource, I think, are important. With that, I will let you do your business.
Great. Thank you, Ken, for your verbal and your written comments as well. Are there others that wish to provide verbal comment? Okay, so not seeing any additional hands. I will note that if there is time towards the end of the meeting and interest, we may have another public comment period. So thanks, and back to you, Renee.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thanks, Ken, for the comment, and thanks to others for listening in today. Eric Hartstein, will you feel free to ping me if we are cranking through the rule set and I forget about the second public comment option, at least offering that up. Feel free to flag that for me. So I think with that, I'm going to pause to see, do RAC members have any questions about run of show for the day or any other kind of more substantive topics that have come to mind for you in the intervening week since we last talked that you would like to flag for today before we start the walkthrough of the rules? All right, hearing none, I think with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to start the walkthrough. And again, there are some pieces where we'll be moving through. We're hoping to make some pretty good time, especially on those areas where we've talked about things a few times, and then we will pause and hold some space for some deeper discussion at certain places in the rule set. So I think with that, Brian, feel free to walk us through the current revised rules draft. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Renee. And Taylor, if you could bring up your screen with, okay, there's our current working version of the rules with our updates. And I'm going to try to quickly move through several topics that we've already discussed at previous meetings. And we did leave comments in to make sure you all see the justification for why something was changed or left as is. And if you have questions as I move through quickly, raise your hand and we can go back to something. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and get going. But we are going to try to cover everything that we've covered in the first two meetings, knowing that there's going to be a few items that are going to take some more involved discussions. But starting with the purpose, there you can see some edits where we have attempted to make a little clearer language, just the acquiring interest in water from willing sellers, just trying to modify that sentence a bit to make it a little clearer. And then you'll see a comment call out box, just the first reference to talking about groundwater protections as a potential project type for the program. And I think we'll cover that later as we get to the eligibility section. And there's a section at the bottom of the purpose statement that's been deleted, and it wasn't necessary to have that in there, and so we're proposing to remove that. And then we'll get into the definitions. So the first definition you see highlighted there is just wording change to the conserve water projects definition. And the definition that we had been using over the last 5 years had been a little bit off in comparison to the definition used by Water Resources Department in explaining their allocation of conserve water program. So we've copied their definition word for word, and that's what you see there. And there are a couple call out comments that we are going to make sure that Department of Justice staff have a look through the definitions that we come up with, make sure that they're consistent with the Constitution and statutes, and definitions are linked properly with Water Resources Department when appropriate. And we also have references at times to overarching rules, rule set Division 5 for OWEB that overrides all the OWEB grant programs. So there at times will be reference to that. But I do see a hand up from Kate.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, and we talked about this last time, so apologies if I forgot how we might resolve it, but just wanted to make sure that the alternative pathway the state's finalized in the Deschutes for conserved water is eligible wherever that, Conserved Water Act shows up in the document.
Yeah,
Whether
we'll cover
that's...
that. Yeah, when
Okay.
we get to the water use agreement definition.
Okay, so that's where that will fall. Sorry, thank
Yeah.
you.
No problem. Let's see.
And
then
Corey,
moving.
oh, sorry,
Oh.
Brian, just Corey, if there's anything that from a WRD perspective in particular, because you and Sarah Henderson have been just fantastic to work with and making sure that we're aligned with definitions, feel free to jump in with any additional information or clarification as needed.
Thanks, Renee. And then the next thing you'll see in the definition changes, you'll just see a cross out of the old conserved water project definition that OWEB did have in its rules that we're proposing to replace with what I already mentioned. And then in item 5, you'll see the in-stream lease, and we just added in a clarification as authorized by Oregon Water Resources Department rather than just an acronym. And so throughout these, we're going to try to clearly spell out the department, Oregon Water Resources Department, when the rules refer to the department or the Oregon revised statutes that the Oregon Water Resources Department operates under. Kaylin, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Brian. Piggybacking onto that, in definition 7 for permanent in-stream transfer, I think if we're going to add Oregon Water Resources Department under, we need to add it at the end of that definition as well.
Good point.
And then I'm jumping ahead to definition 9, but it seems that the form of the definition needs to be revised to match the others, such as, split rate, split duty, and stream lease means a approved lease application. It reads very differently than the other types, and I'm not going to be able to think on my feet to make it good, but just wanted to flag that one.
I believe that wording came straight from the legislation that authorized that new pilot program in the Walla Walla Basin. Anton?
I'm very happy to see the Walla Walla specific call out here, but I just wonder, is that necessary? My understanding is we're going to be going through the same in-stream leasing authority. We needed a little bit of additional authority to do what we're going to do in the Walla Walla, but it's still going to go through the in-stream leasing process, I believe. So I'm just wondering, and maybe OWD folks, you're closer to those nuts and bolts than I am, but I'm not sure that specific definition is necessary. Do we know that it is?
I just know during our second RAC meeting, we talked about modifying the existing split season use in-stream lease to capture the pilot program in the Walla Walla and cleaner and easier to have a separate call out definition specific to the Walla Walla. But I'm certainly willing to hear any discussion on that topic.
Ray, do you have insights that you can share on that, or is this a pin for us to follow up with you and others at WRD?
Yeah, I would agree with that. More like Sarah Henderson. My knowledge of Senate Bill 761 is not very strong. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do, to answer Anton's question, it will. Sarah has already started working on the very first application, and it is going through the in-stream lease program, just like any other in-stream lease.
Okay, thank you, Corey. Yeah, that was my understanding. So I'm just wondering if perhaps it's not necessary to call out specifically, but yeah, maybe Sarah can give us a more definitive answer. Thanks for thinking of us, though. Glad to see it.
All right, so that's something that we'll check in with Water Resources Department staff about that, whether it really is necessary to have a separate definition for that program. Then
Anton, do you have another question, or is that a stale hand?
Legacy hand, thank you.
Okay,
Sorry.
thanks.
And I just wanted to go back up to the definitions that you see for permitted in-stream transfer. Those are drawn from Water Resources Department, but also needs to have that addition of Water Resources Department spelled in to the definition. Kaylin?
Related to Anton's point about being able to wedge in the Walla Walla Authority, I'm struggling to find anywhere where we specifically need to talk about split season in-stream leases in the rules themselves. And I wonder if we can collapse everything into the definition under sub 5 for in-stream lease and just add a reference to sub 3 or to 537, 348, sub 2 and 3. I mean, they're both species of in-stream lease. But just for further consideration, we don't have to figure it out today.
Okay, thanks, Galen. That's a good point. Let's see, the next item, what had been item 9, the technical review teams, it's not necessary to have that in there. That's referenced in the overarching rule set for OWEB grant programs. Let's see, and then down under 11, I've attempted to put together a definition for water interests, since that's referred to in the purpose statement for this program. There isn't a current definition for water interest in any of the Water Resource Department rule sets. And that's just one that I've come up with using some different locations. And then I also put in a water right definition for consideration. But at the same time, we also have the opportunity to use what you see in there for item 14, water use subject to transfer. Maybe that will be adequate to describe what we mean when we're referring to a water right. And I have heard from Water Resource Department staff about the water right definition. They felt like it was general enough that it shouldn't be problematic. But I'm curious to see what RAC members have to think about those two proposed definitions. Kaylin?
I think they're a good start. I know water interest is one that comes right out of the Constitution, or an interest in water, I guess, is the language that they use. And mean, my read of it is it's intended to be broader, like a broader concept than, and I think you've captured this, Brian, than simply, a water right. It's also intended to encompass like a contractual right to use water. And I think that in the water interest definition, it has right to use water, but then it also references including water rights, which I think is just, it's, I would be struggling to understand what's the difference between those two if I was seeing this for the first time. And then my suggestion would be to strike the definition for water right, because some of those legal authorizations are not necessarily state issued. They might be decreed. They might be there's a broader set of authority for a right to use water, and then something that is a legal authorization from OWRD.
Okay, that's a good point, and that is where I do see the utility of the water use subject to transfer definition, which does capture both those, both water approved through a decree and then also more recent approval through Water Resources Department.
And I wonder on that if we can simply reference the statute 540 505 sub 4 instead of reproducing verbatim what's in the statute. And so it would be water use subject to transfer has that definition set forth in statute at ORS 540 505 sub 4.
Mm-hmm.
Anton?
Thank you. Yeah, water use subject to transfer is really our currency, I think. So we would have a lot more comfort with just pointing to that. And I think as Kaylin references, maybe just the statute, rather than trying to define water right again. And when it comes to water interests, you did a very good job trying to define that. My reading was sort of that it was kind of a broad statement in the Constitution. So I wonder, do we have to define that here? Because as Kayla notes, it gets kind of tricky when we're talking about a water right, to use water sources, or it's just a little bit circular there. So I wonder, do we even have to include that definition of water interest here?
We do not. It just seemed like a definition might be needed since it's referenced in the purpose statement and in the Constitution. But when I saw how there is not a clear definition anywhere, that maybe there's a reason for that, and maybe we do just use water use subject to transfer as the replacement for that.
And we can flag all of this for Department of Justice as working through. I think Brian, and we talked about it, maybe even meeting number 1, just the question of, I think what Anton said, like, what's the currency we're actually working with for this particular program? And so I think figuring out how we aren't necessarily trying to define things that don't need to be defined, but being very clear on what is the point, where are those areas where we may need clear definition, because that is the premise of what we are then investing in via various mechanisms in the program. So we can flag that for Department of Justice during their review. But Kaylin, I think you were about to add something that I heard someone chiming in.
That sounds like a good pathway, Renee.
Okay, then moving on, I think that gets us through the end of the definition section. And then we're on to eligibility. Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to bog this down in the Deschutes conserved water pathway, so maybe we could have a conversation with Corey and Sarah or whoever, but it doesn't fit as a water use agreement because it's not an agreement, but it's not a private agreement. It's still a state administered in-stream protection. That actually shows up as a secondary water rights transfer, but and a certificate reduction, but it originates from a conserved water project. So I don't know if it matters so much in the definitions, but when you carry it through to the use of grant funds, which we'll get to, and it says that, you know, paying for infrastructure has to go be associated with the allocation of conserved water program. That's where you'd want to make sure you're including the other state administered program in the Deschutes. So maybe that's an offline conversation.
Yeah, and I do want to state that we did have Water Resources Department staff look at that water use agreement definition in relation to the special management conditions in the Deschutes, the Walla Walla, and the Klamath. And the Water Resource Department staff felt as a whole it covers those special management tools being used in those basins.
So Kate, is the question, you mentioned I think it's the portion that states other private agreements, that didn't feel like a good fit, but
well, in the beginning, it says a contractual agreement between a water right holder and an eligible grant applicant, and it's actually an agreement between a water rights holder and the state, I think. So it is a state administered program that we're working with. Again, I think this falls under like number 6 above. It says or other mechanisms administered by Oregon Water Resources Department. But I just want to make sure that it, you know, again, when you follow through to the use of grant funds, if you're trying to pay for infrastructure, that this is eligible because it is not going through the allocation of conserved water program. So it's a little bit of a nuance, you know, shows up in multiple places kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that. Because again, we want to make sure the right through lines are there without having to call out every unique instance. So Corey, can we put this flag? We'll stay coordinated with you and circle back with the right folks. Just, I think, to have that cross check of if this, then if we connect back up to another definition, do things square. Okay,
and
thank you.
Did want to provide just something to work with when we discuss this with department staff. If we included the state in there, means a contractual agreement between a water right holder, the state, and or an eligible grant applicant. You know, would something like that, if we added in the state of Oregon, would that cover the issue you're getting at, Kate?
It might. I guess I'm more concerned when we get to the use of grant funds, number 2, that it includes that that piece of it. I know that's the intention. I think that's the intention, just making sure that it does.
Okay. All right, then moving on. Were there any other questions on the definition section?
Brian, I did want to flag one piece. This is back up in the purpose. I think it may have been Kaylin. I'm not remembering. At some point, there was a flag about use of legally or contractually protected. And the comment came up, a contract is a legal document. I think it's all legal. It's the question of if it's through maybe a state administrative process or a contract. So that is something that I do have a flag just as we're doing that review with Department of Justice. We don't want to have unnecessary words in this. So we'll just clarify that. I don't think substantively it changes things, but it maybe sends the wrong message about what is or is not a legal document in a way that wasn't intended and isn't necessarily appropriate. So just wanted to close the loop on that when it's on our radar.
Steve?
Yeah, hi there, everyone. Looking at the definition of water use agreement, I just curious if that first sentence there that uses that phrase conserve water, and we have the definition up above about a water conservation project, but a water use agreement is not accomplishing a water conservation project. So I just wonder if the terminology here makes it a little confusing that a water use agreement is accomplishing a water conservation project, which are two different things. It says conserve water or curtail the beneficial use. There could be a different phrase there that said a contractual agreement between a water right holder and an eligible grant applicant to manage water under a water right, subject to transfer, etc., to achieve the contractually protected in-stream flows. I don't think it needs to say conserve water or curtail the beneficial use. Curtail beneficial use is maybe a little bit of a hot phrase there, but anyway, I'd say something more generic, just to manage water differently under the water right.
That's a good point. Thanks. Galen?
Thanks. Steve drawing attention to that one made me notice that it says water right subject to transfer rather than water use subject to transfer. So we should fix that.
Thanks, Kaylin. And thank you, Taylor, for the excellent tracking.
So both places where it states water right, you think that should change to water use?
I'm on, I don't know. Sorry. I unmuted too quickly before I processed. The where I was looking at it was water use subject to transfer. This says water right subject to transfer. So at a minimum, it should change the part that says water right subject to transfer to a water use subject to transfer. And I haven't digested yet whether the other places should get fixed or not.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. I see Taylor's getting that into the notes. Thanks, Taylor. Okay, any further questions or comments or concerns in the definition section? We'll certainly have some of these items. We'll have more information that we'll bring back to the next RAC meeting. But we could now move on to the eligibility section.
So Brian, I'll jump in here and mention this is our first area for holding space for a deeper conversation on one of the meaty topics. So the two questions or topics that I have for this section, and knowing that the first one I'll mention could weave through multiple, is the topic of groundwater eligibility for the program. So we have heard now in 2 written public comments. We heard from Ken earlier. Kaylin, you raised this during the first meeting. I think we've had some touch points here and there since then. It seems important to hold space for this conversation. And while we recognize this weaves throughout the rule set, depending on the direction we go, eligibility seemed as good a place as any to tackle this topic. The second one, which Anton, you may have raised, but I have this placeholder of kind of tribally reintroduced species. And if that has been, if with the current rule language, that's sufficiently well covered. I don't know if you raised that or someone else did, but those are the 2 topics, knowing that the first one is probably more complex than the second, that I want to hold space for. And I'd like to hold at least until 2 o'clock for us to dig into this topic of groundwater. But Brian, I'll see if there's anything else just related to current rule language before we open it up for groundwater and then tribally reintroduced species.
Okay.
Just anything else, Brian, that you want to talk
Yeah.
about related to eligibility?
Yeah, just as you look through some of the proposed changes, you'll see the not subject to forfeiture is highlighted. There have been a question raised about clarity, but that's a phrase that's typically used just to make sure we're working with water rights that have been used in the last 5 years and are valid water rights. And I feel comfortable leaving that phrase in there. And then you'll just see some grammatical changes just to make that read better as it goes through, with moving address. But was wondering if there's any comments or questions about leaving in that phrase, water rights not subject to forfeiture. Not seeing any hands raised, so it looks like RAC members are comfortable with that. And I think after that, I think we could get into the groundwater discussion.
Thanks, Brian. So just for very brief framing, I think the question has come up around, we over the years have referenced in-stream flow in the rule set. I think certainly at least one or two of you have flagged. We've had external comment flagging. I think both opportunities and concerns related to incorporation of groundwater into the program. So I think one, just it would be helpful kind of writ large, I think, to understand the feedback and the perspectives of the RAC on creating that space, kind of going back to what Ken described in his public comment, creating that space along with surface water, in-stream flow within the program. And I think the kind of secondary pieces from that is if yes, then what do we do to ensure that there is alignment with the constitutional direction to the agency regarding benefiting native fish and wildlife species, their habitats, water quality, because we need to ensure that we can pass the straight face test from that perspective. So I think that really is my framing. We are here to kind of listen and take in information. And if there are things that we need to follow up on in terms of constitutional or statutory intent, we absolutely can do that, but would love to hear your perspectives. Anyone interested in kicking us off? Kaylin.
Sure.
Oh, no, sorry. I guess maybe, sorry, Kaylin. Steve had his, I think you two were fighting over who was clicking first. Steve was.
After you, Steve.
Beat you to the punch.
Sorry. Okay. All right. Well, thanks. Well, it was interesting and nice to have the two letters from Water Watch and from Ken Beerley. I thought they both were well written and made interesting points. And it gave me a lot to think about, really. But I just wanted to mention a couple things. I think we can all agree that groundwater and surface water are connected, in some ways, and the new groundwater allocation rules that Water Resources Department went through over the last few years really solidified, I guess you might say, the state's policy of that connection, and is going to result in less groundwater allocation to protect existing water users and existing water rights, both groundwater rights and surface water rights. That was recognized as part of the reason for doing that. And when you're out on a stream in the summer in August and the stream's flowing and the gurgling and the birds are chirping, that is the expression of groundwater that we're seeing out there in the summer. So there's a direct connection. So I thought Ken made an interesting case that it is in OWEB's manifest to possibly do groundwater. The key phrase seems to be land and waters. And you can make the case that both surface and groundwater are waters of Oregon. So I think the key thing is would some acquisition of a groundwater right serve the mission of OWEB and the purpose of the grant program in terms of fish and wildlife? And given that hydraulic connection, I certainly think that's true in some cases where a groundwater right has the pumping from a well, for instance, is having direct interference with a spring or with a surface stream. So I thought Ken made the case that it is within OWEB's purview, but I think it's really a question for OWEB and their board. They must have a lot of thoughts about that. We're here to advise them, but they probably have their own thoughts about that. Despite the letter from Kimberly Priestley at WaterWatch, I doubt that WaterWatch is opposed to protecting or enhancing groundwater-dependent ecosystems. And I think we all are interested in protecting groundwater ecosystems where possible and feasible. The argument in her letter seems to be that there is no way to legally protect those groundwater rights in stream or in a lake, for instance. And that may be the case. It seems to be the case. I haven't thought of any. I've talked to, people I know and nobody seems to come up with a way to legally protect that water in stream. So it would fall under the category of a water use agreement, which luckily OWEB has the ability to make water use agreements, and we have. And there have been a number of water use agreements around the state that have been very successful in certain circumstances. It's really a case by case and a specific location thing as to what's the best type of water transaction to do with someone. Is it going through Water Resource Department and creating an in-stream water right? Or is it some other water use agreement where you can compel the water right holder to manage use of that water right differently to benefit the stream? And so there have been quite a number of water use agreements that have been successful. I think the situation where this would be a good thing for OWEB to fund would be a relatively large well that's relatively close to a relatively small stream and or spring. And there's reason to believe that the use of water under that well is hydraulically connected and is impairing the spring or the stream and causing negative environmental impacts. So that might be a situation where we would want to fund such an acquisition, and it would be a private contract between a conservation group such as TU or DRC or someone else and the water right holder that would compel the water right holder to, for instance, shut off his pump on July 1st and let the groundwater recover and let the spring recover. And so I think the things I would think that we should really think about is how directly should the hydraulic connection be before we would want to fund such an acquisition. We want demonstrable and measurable benefits from the project. So you want to, I think, have a relatively high bar in terms of hydraulic connection and a relatively high bar in terms of the monitoring that would go with it to ensure that there are, in fact, environmental benefits consistent with the program's goals.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Super helpful framing. Kaylin?
Well, I'm glad Steve got his hand up before I did, because I feel like he laid out a really compelling case and summary of why this has been an issue that we've wanted to try to explore through this RAC. I wanted to build on a point that Steve made regarding the water use agreement being the pathway that would likely be available at this time if groundwater rights were to enter into the scope of this program. And I think we as a state should also be looking at, this isn't the purview of this RAC, but changing our statutes to enable in situ protections of groundwater. And so I think depending on how we might incorporate changes into OWEB's rules, it not only would accomplish the ability to select very, like I think as Steve laid out, a pretty narrow case-by-case determination of a groundwater impact that could potentially be remedied in a way that would generate a significant benefit to a native fish and wildlife habitat of Oregon, but also position us to be able to take advantage of future changes to statute that would, allow us to do protections of groundwater in situ. Just a couple other thoughts to throw in would be that groundwater is clearly a climate resilience strategy. And as our surface water supplies become more variable and our precipitation in winter and summer becomes more variable, we are increasingly going to be relying on groundwater in this state to meet our water needs, both in stream and out of stream. And those groundwater dependent ecosystems are going to become increasingly vital for that cold, clean water supply. So I really appreciated that Ken kind of took the ideas that we've independently been talking about in the RAC, and that I feel like his comment lays out really compellingly why perhaps our current rules take an artificially narrow perspective on only limiting it to surface supplies. So just take it as I do think there's a case to be made that groundwater rights should be, or maybe groundwater rights should be considered interests in water that would be properly within the scope of these rules and this program. And yes, it is different, and it is potentially requires some more analysis to determine the direct benefit that groundwater rights adjustments would have on native fish and wildlife. But I think that we're at a point where, and we have smart enough people on the technical review teams and on the board and at the agency to be able to determine if a particular proposal kind of passes muster and meets that high standard. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kaylin. Thoughts from other RAC members? Spencer.
I certainly appreciate the intention. I think we all acknowledge we need to protect groundwater dependent ecosystems. Just coming at it from the hydrologic kind of science side of things, the groundwater surface water interconnection is very nuanced and site specific, and it's not a one size fits all. Changes based on the duration of pumping, the specific hydrogeological conditions. So I guess I'm just skeptical that there's a simple and straightforward way to quantify that relationship for all sites. I agree with the things that Steve said. There are certain instances where you can think of a very large spring with a well adjacent to it where it's relatively intuitive to, assume there's 100% connection, but that's not the case for a lot of groundwater wells connected to surface water. The tools that OWRD uses regularly to make those assessments are relatively rudimentary, and it's complicated stuff. To really fine tune it takes 2D hydrologic models and things like that I don't think are, typically going to be employed by the review committee. So although I appreciate the intention, I just don't think the science is there at the moment to be able to quantify that connection.
Thank you, Spencer. Feedback from others. Anton.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly full agreement with all the speakers here today about the importance and the connection of the two. Of course, the devil's in the details here. So I've certainly been thinking about how would one try to craft rules to accommodate this, but try to guarantee that we're actually getting that direct benefit to native fish and wildlife habitat. It would be very difficult, I think, for all the reasons that have been mentioned here already. You know, one thing that occurred to me, I wonder if we could use this to try to incentivize the state going in the right direction, and in the few places where there is co-management of surface water and groundwater, maybe suggest that groundwater acquisitions would be eligible there, since the agency is managing the two conjunctively, to try to help encourage that to happen elsewhere. But yeah, just really difficult to figure out how we might craft rules that would pass that straight face test. But that was one idea I had. Admittedly, that would very much prescribe where this would be eligible, but I think we could feel better about actually getting some benefit for protecting groundwater in those few areas where the state is managing them conjunctively.
Anton, just so that I'm clear, are you talking about Walla Walla and Harney when you say few areas?
So admittedly, there aren't many. There might be others that I'm not aware of, but for instance, here in the Umatilla, very rudimentary, Spencer pointed out, we just have a buffer around the river where the state will regulate off junior groundwater users in favor of live flows in the Umatilla River. It's very crude. It's just a buffer. I forget what the distance is buffered from the river, but the state is managing conjunctively there. So I would feel confident if we acquired a groundwater right within that buffer that, you know, there would be some direct benefit to the Umatilla River from having done that, just because it's part of the state's management regime. So that was the one example I was thinking of. There might be others across the state, but something like that.
Thanks for that clarification. Feedback from others? All right, not seeing other hands going up. So Anton, I appreciate the framing that you provided. Given the grant making role, the non-regulatory grant making role of OWEB, I think the key as we're thinking through this is not unnecessarily or inappropriately limiting openness and eligibility for projects that can benefit species, and being able to be incredibly clear with any interested party or applicant coming into the program, what are the rules of the road? Because what we want to do is not have folks, you know, thinking that it may be a bar here to meet when actually the bar might be here, related to expectations of benefiting native species. So that is squarely on our mind as we think about not only eligibility, but then how does it play out for applicants? And I think making sure that we are positioning our reviewers and our board to be successful in their evaluation of these. I think already about some of there've been very good and robust conversations that Brian and I just in the last few years have had with the board, but water acquisitions are complex. And so just being very clear on what are the tools available for applicants, what are the tools available for reviewers, and how do we translate this to the board? So, you know, at this point, we are not kind of putting a flag in the ground of this is exactly where we think we should land, but those are some of the things that we're thinking through from a staff perspective of, if these are incorporated, then what are some of those considerations, requirements, just being the kind of transparency components that we would want to make sure are articulated well in the rules. So given that, and I know some of you already touched on some of those considerations, are there any other thoughts that you have for us about, hey, as you're thinking through this and giving an update to your board, for example, at upcoming board meetings about the rulemaking, here are some things we also think that you should be thinking about. Because we are not WRD, we are not the regulator. We want to make sure we're staying in our lane of grantor and being an accessible grantor, and a transparent one. So just any other thoughts or feedback given that? Ken? Actually, hold on. Ken, wait just a second. Eric Hartstein, help me know the correct thing to do in terms of public meeting law, because Ken is not on our rack.
Yeah, I think we can allow comments right now or questions.
Okay, go for it, Ken.
Yeah.
Oh, and Meg may have to help you unmute.
Do we have a hand raised? I'm not seeing one, sorry.
Ken had his hand raised and then maybe took it down. Ken Beerley.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Give me just 1 second.
Thanks, Meg.
Perfect. You're all good.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the thoughtful comments that have come from the RAC members. I think it's important to think about this in 2 ways. One is, should it be eligible? Should groundwater be eligible as a water right? If so, then under what conditions would that be reasonably funded? And what I've suggested is a 2-step process. The first step is the basin closed to further groundwater development? That's a yes or no question. It's either closed by classification or critical groundwater area designation. So that's a yes or no. It's easily determinable whether or not a rate would be eligible for consideration. And then the second step I have articulated is that they would have to demonstrate, so it would be the purpose, the responsibility of the applicant to demonstrate that there is a groundwater dependent ecosystem that is directly affected by the pumping from that water right, and the significance of that impact, and then the significance of the GDE to Oregon's fish and wildlife resources. So I think you can structure it so that, one, you're assured that the groundwater right isn't simply subsumed by other development in the basin, but 2, then you put the burden on the applicant to demonstrate do you get the benefits of that are being proposed, and that would give the reviewers something to look at and evaluate. So that I agree that this is difficult without having some in situ groundwater statute. There's a recent U of O law article that came out in December of last year about that, a piece, co-written piece by University of Oregon Law School. But I really agree with what Caitlin was saying, is if you do allow this under narrow circumstances, then there might be consideration at the legislative level to look at ways to conserve groundwater at the in situ. But I truly recognize that that's a problem. It's managed differently or legally differently than surface water. Thank you for the opportunity to yammer.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it. Okay, so any final thoughts on this? Oh, yep, Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just such an interesting topic. I have to weigh in. And I agree with all that's been said. I think eventually we'll want to do this in the state for sure. The real trick is how to demonstrate the benefit. And so thinking about your question to what could you let the applicant know, because there's so much uncertainty around, and we want to set the reviewers up for success. So, kind of piggybacking on Ken, like, what kind of scientific assessment would be necessary, like making it pretty clear the bar that has to get met, both on the sort of hydrologic connection side, but also on the water rights management side of what other water rights are in the area. You don't want to just shut off a well and have someone else, be withdrawing more water. And Ken, I really appreciated your 7-page missive laying it all out. And, you know, I agree with your specific suggestions that you had in number 4. I agree with the B, you know, can show a direct and demonstrable impact on a groundwater dependent ecosystem. And maybe there's a piece there, you know, that supports important fish and wildlife habitat. But that's hard to do. And I would just caution that respectfully that the first phrase A that you had, our in a restricted groundwater use area, in and of itself, you could still have someone else sucking up that water that already was permitted. So I would really focus on either A and B together or just, yeah, maybe A and B together. Sorry, I'm looking at Ken's document right now for what I'm referencing. So I do think I agree with, you know, Kaylin and others. This is going to be a really critical issue. We just aren't there yet legally or maybe scientifically. So I think it's a hard question for OWEB on, do you want to at least put the eligibility in there and then try to figure out how to assess and review and get enough information? Or is that going to be too cumbersome? And I'll leave that up to you smart people.
Thanks, Kate. And that's why we have really smart people on our racks too to help us sort through these issues. Okay, so I'm going to go to Kaylin, and then Ken, I'm actually going to have you hold your comment because I do want to move us to follow through on my own direction to the rack that we need to make some progress today. So Kaylin, let's go to you, and then we're going to continue moving through the rules.
Thanks. I'll make this real quick. I will say that I think under the existing rules, in a particular case, if the right groundwater right came along and doing a water use agreement with that water right could result in contractually protected flow, there might still be a path under the existing rules. So I just want to put that out there so that I, you know, don't necessarily foreclose OWEB from being able to look at like a beautiful and unique proposal that happened to come through in its near future. And that I think, you know, as Spencer highlighted, the science is still working on it, and also science is moving real fast these days. So looking forward to getting better in the years ahead.
Thanks, Kaylin. Okay, so Ken, hold your comment please for later when hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for public comment. Kate, is that a legacy hand? Okay. All right, so we have just over 15 minutes until our scheduled break. I do want to check on the topic of tribally reintroduced species that came up from someone at some point. So currently in terms of eligibility and maybe elsewhere in the rule set, do folks feel as though this is sufficiently well addressed, or is there any hesitation with current phrasing on there being an unintended ineligibility or disqualification?
Is there something other than one sub A there when you asked that question, Renee?
That's the primary location. I do think similar, if not the exact same language. Maybe I think down in evaluation criteria, there's reference to helps achieve any state, federally, tribally supported flow target, and then it references conservation plans. So just those are the primary areas. So I think, Anton, if you could maybe take a read through and see if there's anything that seems problematic from a tribally reintroduced species perspective.
Okay, yeah, I'll certainly take a closer look at that. When I first saw the issue, I was a little perplexed because we're focused on native fish and wildlife species, and the tribes are certainly going to be reintroducing species that were native, so there shouldn't be any issue there. But of course, we'd like to see those co-management capacities called out, which I think they are here, but I will take a closer look at that and report back.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I think with that, Brian, we can transition to the use of grant funds. There are at least one other kind of meaty topic on this one that I'm hoping we maybe can get through. before break. But Brian, do you want to do an overview of the edits thus far to the use of grant funds section?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Renee. Yeah, in the use of grant funds section, we have added in a number 2, looking at the cost of a water acquisition project for water conveyance or water use efficiency, such as equipment, parts, installation, labor that results in legally protected in-stream water rights using the Oregon Water Resource Department's allocation of conserved water program. And that's, we didn't have that clearly in there before and thought we should add that. So that's one item. And then we have also made an adjustment to the language in number 4, replacing outreach with engagement. And that's referring to the engagement with water right holders to pursue potential in-stream water transactions. And then in number 5, as we described due diligence activities, I think that language that was in there had a lot of that had come from the land acquisition program at OWEB. And I just thought we might want to consider putting in water right reviews. And I know that as part of any water transaction that's occurring, and I thought it might be helpful to call that out. But those were just the proposed changes.
All right, so any comments or questions for Brian on those? Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I have a comment about this section. The program is really just set up to acquire water rights, to improve stream flow, etc. Whether the cost of acquiring that right is through piping and an allocation or a conserved water project, that creates one cost for those units of water that you're acquiring versus the other methods of acquiring the water. And I think it really comes down to, what's the cost benefit. And so whether the program's paying for the cost of water conveyance infrastructure or just making a payment to a landowner for his water right, I just think it has to be a sensible cost. And that's what's maybe a little different about OWEB's water acquisition grant compared to water project grants and loans, for instance, that Water Resource Department operates. There, the benefits of the project have to do with social, economic, and environmental benefits. So it's a sort of a trifecta. Now, these allocation of conserved water projects have a lot of public benefits. They reduce poor quality return flow. So there's water quality benefits. They have economic benefits. They have on-farm benefits in terms of increasing the output of agricultural production, etc. But I think this program is slightly different in that we really need to look hard at what are the costs what are we paying for the water we're getting? And conservation projects can be quite expensive and result in relatively little water. That's been the experience of some of the projects that we have funded through this program and through water project grants and loan. It doesn't mean they're bad projects or they're not in the public interest. They just tend to have a high cost for the water you get. So I don't really have a change to offer here. I just think that maybe that's somehow we capture that in the guidance or somewhere else that, when we look at cost effectiveness. But it seems to me the language that Brian has added here is fine as it is, but I just want to make that point about cost and benefits.
Thanks for that, Steve. And maybe flag that when we get to evaluation criteria. I think some of the effort here with the rule revisions has been to get better and differently at infrastructure projects that are utilizing allocation of conserved water, because that has been kind of a newer space, and at times exactly what you have raised has come up as a line of questioning for the board. And we've talked about if that is what a landowner and water right holder wants to do, that is the tool that's available. And so figuring out how to not preclude use of that. But definitely flag that for us when we get down to evaluation criteria if you think we need to lean in on that a bit more there. Kaylin?
Wanted to point, I think that we need to reference back to the definition for conserved water project rather than using a new term of allocation of conserved water program, which isn't actually how we refer to it earlier in the definition section. And again, it's kind of the same situation with legally protected in-stream water rights. If everyone knows what that means, we can set it aside, but it's kind of like a new idea combination of multiple terms that could be confusing to folks.
Thanks for flagging that. Okay, any other comments on current edits? All right, I want to do a process check. So we're 8 minutes from our scheduled break, and the primary meaty topic for this section is this topic of programmatic costs for things like project development. Design actually may be also as part of this. We've talked about this at both of the prior RAC meetings, and we talked about, and we made a request, I think both Jessica and Kate maybe offered to bring some real world examples of where have we bumped into challenges when we've tried to utilize other OWEB programs, such as engagement or technical assistance, to get at some of these programmatic costs that it takes for long-term relationship building, spending the time thinking through how does a particular water rate fit into the strategy that you're trying to implement in a particular basin to get to flow restoration. So I want to hold some space for that. I think Eric Hartstein can talk with us a little bit about the partnership TA grant program. However, I think this is going to be at least 15 minutes, folks. So do you want to take a quick break now and then jump into this? Or are we ready to just dig into programmatic costs? Okay, Steve's nodding, I think dig in. Does anyone have concerns and need a break? Okay.
Say break.
Who said, someone said take a break?
That was me.
Okay, all right. Let's commit. Can we be back at 2:30? Does that work for folks? Okay. We'll see you soon. Thank you, Eric Hartstein, for keeping this a civil RAC meeting that allows people to take breaks before 2 hours in.
I just figured that this might go a little longer than 2:30, and
Yep.
you know how it goes. So
Yep.
having a break is always nice.
Yep. All right. So thanks everyone for taking a quick break, coming back promptly. I want to make sure we have Taylor. Taylor, maybe just thumbs up if you want to stay off camera. I just want to make sure that in case there's any note taking, we're good. All right. Okay, well, maybe what I'll do is go ahead and just kind of introduce this. The primary change, as I can see it, and Eric Hartstein check me on this, and any of you who were RAC members during the last rule revision, the primary change in this section is that we previously said related to the planning and or implementation of water acquisition projects. And then I believe to make sure that we could see that direct line from two implementable projects. The last rule revisions tightened that down to related to the implementation of water acquisition projects. So we've definitely heard from folks. This has been challenging at times because it takes a long time and a lot of legwork to get to a viable project. So either Jessica or Kate, I did ask you to ponder this a little bit. If you have some feedback for us, because I think the interest in putting this on the table is not to say, let's open up the use of grant funds eligibility to projects that would not have a chance of resulting in protected and stream flow or flow that benefits native fish and wildlife species. But if we are hamstringing unnecessarily the ability to have more kind of fully loaded costs, we need to talk through that and what might be possible without divesting in the actual transactions themselves. Not, basically creating just another engagement pot of funding. That's not the interest here. So maybe Jessica or Kate, if you have thoughts, experiences to share, and then Eric Hartstein, if you're willing to talk a little bit about partnership TA, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this a little bit. So for TU's flow restoration program in Oregon, a lot of our work is concentrated in Northeast Oregon and in the Columbia Basin. So we have significant support, programmatic support from the Columbia Basin Water Transaction Program here that has allowed us to establish and have a longstanding program and have consistency of funding to be able to build projects over the long term, projects and whole programs in different areas. The place where I have specific experience with capacity funding being an issue and a hindrance to developing these type of transactions is our work down in the Rogue Basin. So in the Rogue, we have utilized for our project manager down there, we have been relatively successful with other OWEB programs to help support this work. And I can get into the specifics of how we've done that, but mainly stakeholder engagement. We've had some traction there, especially with the initial standing up of that position that we wanted to establish in the basin. And then we have been able to supplement with internal like cold water conservation funds, Forest Service funds, Rogue Basin Partnership to extend the stakeholder engagement funds we were awarded, like make everything last longer to support the position over the long term. But we have had we have also tried, after establishing that position, to go back to the stakeholder engagement program. And we're not successful in one round. We have one currently in play that looks like it's recommended for funding now and above the funding threshold. So all that to say, with stakeholder engagement specifically related to this type of work, we have had some success, but it continues to be for what we need for this type of work, it's not always consistent or reliable enough. You know, we never know if we will be awarded in a given year or if the funds will run out and we won't be recommended for funding in another year. So the consistency of it is problematic for maintaining a program like this over the long term. You know, OWEB programs are also, for the most part, extremely competitive. I was looking back through some numbers of like percent funded in different years of the applications recommended for funding in each category, like the percent that was funded. And for stakeholder engagement, it was, you know, 50% a couple of years ago. It's been 30%. Same with TA funding, you know, very competitive and highly subscribed. So it is not something we can rely upon to maintain our program. And I also feel that what we're talking about here is the need for like true capacity for this type of program, really not tied to specific project or even specific engagement or outreach efforts. And I'm not sure stakeholder engagement, that's the true intention of it, really. It, you know, wants to be tied more to specific engagement areas or types of outreach, whereas the need is a little bit more for consistent, broad capacity funding over relatively long periods of time so that programs can build and projects can develop over that period of time. So yeah, I guess in summary, we've had some success utilizing these other programs to help support capacity for these programs outside of the Columbia Basin or this work outside the Columbia Basin. But the consistency and the competitiveness of the programs make it difficult to rely upon and truly build a long-term program in one area without spending a lot of time seeking other funding sources. That applies to both stakeholder engagement and TA is similarly not exactly the right fit for the type of capacity funding we're asking for, and very competitive and needed for design and other projects or other types of work as well throughout the state. So yeah, that is a bit about our personal experience trying to maintain a program in a basin outside of the Columbia Basin in Oregon right now. I don't know if that was the type of thing you were, information you were looking for.
That's super helpful, Jess. Thank you so much. Kate, anything to add or kind of an additional different perspective on this topic?
Sure, I would agree with everything Jess said. The SC and TA grants are more time bound, and I think designed more towards a project or specific planning area that might reap a few projects. And so the time scale, you know, it's not matching up with the needs for a sustainable program. And when I kind of zoom up and look at, you know, when OWEB was formed to do restoration in the state, you know, there was a decision to invest in Watershed Council's ongoing capacity to result in restoration projects. And OWEB also has goals on the flow restoration side, but the water trusts doing that, you know, don't receive that capacity funding. And when you think about watershed councils, they're in almost every basin in the state, partially sustained by OWEB capacity funds. And if you look at who's trying to get water transactions done in the state, you know, we're on this call pretty much. We've got Anton, we've got TU, DRC, and then thankfully ODFW is starting to get into the work, but there's a lot more work to be done. And it's really complex work with the relationship building, the understanding the geography, the water rates, the hydrology, the expertise in how to do transactions, the monitoring. And I guess it just really struck me at the OEB board meeting on the water acquisitions panel. One of the board members said something like, can we just order up some more transactions in this geography, not in that language, but you can if there's not the capacity built to be doing those transactions like Jess was talking about, specifically outside of the Columbia, but even enough capacity across the state within the Columbia Basin too. So again, we all recognize the challenge of not wanting to undermine the transactions pot. We want to get projects done on the ground, but I'm wondering if there's a way to build at least some capacity that can create a sustainable program so that there are a flow of projects coming more consistently. And curious how to bound that so it's appropriate, and I think I'm curious if you had any sort of guidelines around that when you had planning in the program. Is it a certain, I would recommend some certain percentage or a cap on it, and then maybe there's some performance results associated with it. Not an endless supply of capacity money. So I'd be curious what you all experienced in the past and if there's anything to learn from that. But yeah, thanks for having the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. So any questions from fellow RAC members for Jessica or Kate? All right, not seeing any. So Eric Hartstein, I think my request may be twofold because I think at this point, your memory is better than mine. So I know you were slated to talk a little bit about partnership technical assistance, which is one of OWEB's standing grant programs, and just maybe some similarities to what pieces of this might be. But if you have any better recollection than I do about some of the implementation specifics when we did have both planning and implementation as eligible uses of grant funds in the rule set, I would appreciate it because my memory is very hazy back to 2013.
Well, thanks, Renee. I disagree pretty strongly that my memory is better than yours on this. So I'd have to go back and look on some of our past documents when we had incorporated planning as a program element. But with the partnership technical assistance offering, yeah, I don't know if this is going to be a really big help here because it is kind of describing another. And I appreciated both your comments, Jessica and Kate, on kind of these are highly prescribed, very competitive grant programs that kind of lead to projects on the ground. Partnership technical assistance is an offering that we have for existing partnerships to either develop a strategic action plan towards specific goals, or if you do have an existing strategic action plan, to support that partnership and kind of that plan coordination and ultimately implementation. So there's a couple of different, I think, avenues that might support partnerships that are either focused almost exclusively on water acquisitions, or maybe have that as a important component of their partnership. And with a strategic action plan, I think it could only help with the competitiveness with other grant programs, be they engagement, technical assistance, or ultimately the water acquisitions grant program itself. So that's another potential avenue for folks that are interested in this program. I don't know if we've seen. I know we haven't seen exclusive water acquisition partnerships come through, but I don't know if we've seen partnerships that have water acquisition as a component of their partnership. So, end of report on partnership TA, Renee. And let me know if there's any questions.
Any questions for Eric? All right, so I think to Kate's point, we need to look back at some of the specifics around that shift, because we did have space for in the 2013 vintage rules, strategic planning and development, project design, landowner outreach, and other activities associated with water acquisitions in a given basin or other defined area. I know there was also reference back then to kind of a business plan, maybe akin to some of what Eric was talking about with the strategic action plan. I think that was some of the terminology we were using back then. So we can look back at some of those pieces. I do think that I hear you, Jess, about the capacity discussion and the pie doesn't get any bigger when we add other programs. So I think part of the question and the work of this group and staff as we're supporting you all and taking things to the board is, did we lose anything during that 2019-2020 rulemaking around some of this strategic action planning and development, project design, some of those core pieces that just you all need to do to build these projects, and they will draw a line to some projects that then may come into OWEB for funding, but they might not always. And so I think part of that is kind of revisiting that topic. Did we lose some opportunities that are causing some hamstringing? But recognizing if we create space for other investment areas, it doesn't mean that there are more resources to invest. It may just either spread the peanut butter a little bit thinner, which can result in frustration too, or have unmet expectations. So we can go back and do some homework as we are doing that. I guess any of you who were on that 2019-2020 rack, if you have recollection of those conversations that you want to share with us as you agreed that maybe that trade-off is important and we lean more in on direct implementation, we would love to hear that. And I think it was like Kate, Anton, Kaylin, yes, you were on that rack. So any memory to impart?
My memory's just
Kaylin?
as good as yours and Eric's these days, so unfortunately, no.
Thanks, Anton. Kaylin's going to save the day.
Sure. No, Kaylin's not. But I do seem to remember a lot of discussion around the coordinated funding framework. I mean, that was something we spent a lot of time on. So there was just like a different focus at that time. And I've been reflecting a bit on how much things have changed since then. And at that point, there was like no funding for the program. It was, we're at like 0, and it would get plopped in there and then it would get swept. And since then, there's been the ability to create a bit of a corpus for actually building momentum for water acquisitions. And so I think that we're in a different position now, practically, and hopefully we want to maintain this more robust funding reality that we find ourselves. And so I think it is appropriate for us to be looking at creating the preconditions for water acquisitions to happen, because it's not like it was like pennies before. It was really bad. So that's just where I remember a lot more talk was about things like creating efficiencies through the coordinated funding framework. And I just don't remember as much discussion around other things.
Thank you for that, Kaylin. Steve, go ahead.
Well, real quick, on one hand, I really appreciate that OWEB funds, transaction costs through the transaction, the way that it is laid out here. But as others have said, that's not a really sort of stable, reliable funding to build staff around and to build a program around. And that's always kind of been a problem. The Oregon Water Trust had that problem, funding was spotty and hard to keep adequate staff, and Oregon Water Trust merged into Oregon Trout with the idea that it was going to increase the pace and scale of this sort of work around the state, and for a variety of reasons, maybe that didn't happen. But I just strongly believe that it needs to happen. And I would just point to the latest version of the integrated water resource strategy and the priorities that the agency leaders developed. One of those is to align existing and future agency funding to further in-stream flow restoration. And it goes on a little bit from there, but I think now is the time, and I just encourage OWEB and others to really think about how do we build a more stable funding and unlock the bottleneck we currently have, which is not enough deal makers out on the ground working with water right holders. That's the problem. Really, we have the funding in this grant program to pay for deals. We just don't have enough people making the deals. And I guess the other comment I make is, historically, transaction costs have been really high. It takes a lot of time and effort. These deals are complex to put together, as others have said, and you might spend years negotiating with a landowner. So there's all these sunk transaction costs. And I think the key thing there is stable funding so that we don't have a lot of fits and starts. The Oregon Water Trust used to work in the Rogue Basin quite a bit. Well, Trout Unlimited has had to come back in there and basically build everything back up from scratch. So there's a lot of lost, sunk costs there. So we need stable funding. And, I hope we talk more about that either through this RAC forum when we're done or some other forum, put our heads together and figure out how can we make this happen and help the practitioners out there be as effective as possible. There is lots of good deals to be done if you dig hard enough, and they're digging, but they need more help.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, any other comments on this? Because we will be transitioning.
Oops.
Okay, good. Okay, and Brian, just a heads up for you. I think we sent around to the RAC members that allowable costs and combined land and water transactions is something we want to touch on. If you're okay, Brian, I want to go ahead and just hold that because I think that we haven't experienced it an enormous amount. I think let's just hold that to the next meeting so we can continue to make progress. Are you all right with that?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right, so let's jump to the good transition to the coordinated funding.
Well,
section,
there was
is that right?
actually one more item in use of grant funds, and that's the last item, number 7. And that's where we made a little modification to the cost of monitoring of water acquisition projects, where we took out the reference to the Constitution and added in consistent with the intent of the grant application, allowing for any conditions listed in the grant agreement. And there's been some, at the last RAC meeting, there was discussion about some of the challenges of doing the monitoring, especially with the 10% holdback. But I did want to clarify that 10% holdback that OED requires with its grant funding is it can be up to 10% depending on the grant type. And so there is an opportunity to modify that prior to the grant agreement or even an amendment later on if necessary and if it can be justified. But yeah, and then we can, I think the next topic or the next section is matching contributions, where we just clarified that the percentage of match can change each grant cycle, and it will be announced in the grant offering what that match requirement is going to be. And then there was just a removal of a reference in 1B to the coordinated funding framework. And then, but now that brings us to the coordinated and partnering with other funders section, unless anyone had any comments on that monitoring or match discussion. Not seeing any hands raised. So Renee, you want to talk about your thoughts on the coordinating and partnering with other funders?
Yeah, and Steve, I recognize this is going to fly in the face of what you said. It would be great if the agencies could all get aligned on the current and future investments. I do recall this one. We structured this thinking, I think, somewhat optimistically 13 years ago that we lots of different funders could just kind of put money into a single pot and use one common funding program to get money out the door for water acquisitions. And then we find that things like BPA's requirements sometimes bump in in an unhelpful way with OWEB state requirements. And so the proposal, though, there's a section of this that's captured above, so it was redundant with a few different sections above, but the piece around creating efficiencies and finding opportunities, I did propose that we move that down to the evaluation process. Let's see, that's 0200, and it would be a new sub 3 about to the extent practicable, trying to find those operational efficiencies and complementary investments and utilizing our review process, including our technical review team members who oftentimes are also overseeing programs that invest in these types of activities to help with some of that coordination. So that's my proposed approach, to be, I think, honest about how the idea of throwing our funding into a single pot with others was somewhat idealistic, but not letting us off the hook to try to have some alignment and co-investment where possible, and using the review process for that. So questions or feedback on that? Okay. Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, then that brings us to the evaluation criteria. And in there, if you look at, Spencer?
Sorry, I was a little bit slow on the draw there. Renee, maybe I missed it. Where did the mention of DEQ and ODFW and tribal interest move to? Was that eliminated entirely, or did it get put somewhere else?
I think I have it in the comment, but let me check. That was redundant language from addressed in -0035 above. So I believe that in eligibility, the ODF, there's 1A is the ODFW, and then other federal tribal fish agency piece. 1B is the DEQ water quality piece.
Oh, I see that. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Thanks for checking.
Okay, well, that brings us to evaluation criteria. And the first item that we're proposing to modify is sub 1A, where we're talking about professionally accepted flow targets, and clarifying that we're talking about state, federally, and tribally supported flow targets. And during the period of use is problematic when you think of source water switches, like what occurs with the Deschutes alternative pathway, where the time of use for the out of stream use doesn't line up with when the benefits occurring in stream. So we thought it might be problematic to have that phrase in there. And then also the idea of adding in dry year drought conditions is problematic because there's different interpretations of what is a dry year, what is a drought. And so we just thought we would focus on state, federally, and tribally supported flow targets. The next, I see a hand raised, Kaylin.
Thanks, Brian. How would an applicant demonstrate that the flow target is supported by a state, the feds, or a tribe? Would it be through reference to a publication or a letter of support? That word support is, I'm stumbling a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's referring to a flow target that's been developed by a state or federal agency or a tribe. So if you feel like we need to replace support and go back to accept, that's fine. Spencer?
I think we made a note last time that we wanted to have a little bit of wiggle room for non-agency developed flow targets if there's a collaborative effort. So I think that's why it's either the accepted or supported. It doesn't necessarily have to be developed by the state, the feds, or the tribes. It can be a non-agency developed target that is accepted by those groups. I don't think that addresses Kaylin's concern, but that was the rationale there.
If we
I
change
think.
that to accepted or supported, would that cover that concern?
Spencer, does that cover what you flagged?
I think either one works. My point is that it's not. I thought Brian said that it was a state, federally, or tribally developed target, and I think we want to be clear that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think as it is, it's fine in my mind.
And so then I think, Brian, you were suggesting develop to get at Kaylin's point, which is we don't ask folks like you need to get a letter of support from ODFW or Umatilla tribes on everything. I mean, yes, it'd be great if you have one, but it's around they need to be able to point to this is in X document, essentially, that has gone through a particular process for identification of the flow target. So if the word supported is sending a message, like an inadvertent message around like how an applicant needs to be able to prove that up, that we don't want that to be the case. But there are specific questions, Kaylin, in the application about that. So does that help on your question, Kaylin?
I think if it's in the application and it's asking where is your flow target coming from, yeah, I think you can get there. It's just the word is it implies, I think, maybe just something different than something that is. It just feels a little different than accepted. It's like if you have to like proactively support it, rather.
Oh.
But I'm not with a state, a federal agency, or a tribe, so that's just pointing out from a possible applicant confusion perspective.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Brian, we can noodle on that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come up with a alternative. Then the next item is 1C, where we just added in for monitoring that could be monitoring project compliance and project outcomes. And that's just something that the review team can consider how that's occurring. We removed the reference to climate change adaptation. And then there was a thought to target adequate seniority to ensure reliability of wet water, and instead we're proposing to move that reference to seniority into the next line, into sub 2, how the water rights ownership, demonstration of use, validity, reliability, and seniority will result in in-stream flow improvements. And then you'll see the next change that there's a strikeout on ownership, use, validity, and reliability. That's been struck out as that's just been mentioned in the previous edition. And then you'll see in subset 2C, and that's where it's mentioning if the project's using the allocation of conserved water program, the review team will consider the project cost relative to the amount of water right and percentage of the conserved water that will be protected in stream. And then there's a cleanup of the way the wording was in sub 3C. And that's just condensing and everything down to just address the state, federal, or tribal agency priorities for aquatic habitat, in-stream flow restoration, or water quality management. And then there was a thought to include ensures water and drought and or dry water years. But again, it seems like that's problematic, that it's too vague, and to consider removing that. And Kaylin?
Thanks. I have a couple of thoughts on this section for evaluation criteria. One is under new 3C. Again, I think we want to be consistent with referring to either probably a conserved water project instead of referring to the allocation of conserved water program. I'm not sure what the amount of the water right means. It could be read a few different ways. That's in the same subsection, sub C. And then I was curious about the striking sub 1F contributes to climate change adaptation. I know there was the OWEB resolution a couple few years ago in directing incorporation of climate into rulemakings. And so if there's not a separate rulemaking that has accomplished that, it seems that that's something that might need to stay in or even get strengthened.
Thankfully, Kaylin, there was a rulemaking.
Right.
So yes. So the climate criteria perpetuate through all of our grant making.
So that's why it's stricken here, is that it is part of all of them. Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Good
Brian,
comments,
do we
Kaylin.
need to talk about what does amount of water right mean? Do we need to talk with the RAC about that?
Yeah, and that's where just referring to the amount of the original consumptive water right. And what I was getting at is the allocation of conserved water program allows a water right holder to only put in 25% or a greater amount if there's public dollars contributing to it. And this is just looking at not only what proportion of that original consumptive water right is going in stream, but also what percent of the conserved water is going in stream. And what I'm trying to get at is just increasing the value of this water transaction. That this is something that's clearly reviewed and looked at, especially for some of these projects that can be very expensive. But what is the actual value gain to the in-stream flow? And I'm trying to address some of the concerns raised by OWEB board members when we have brought recommendations to them that are expensive projects that are providing benefit, and just trying to look at that proportion of how much water versus the cost of the project. And if there's a greater percentage of that conserved water going in, then that could be considered as the cost of the project is being reviewed.
So evaluation criteria for infrastructure projects, efficiency and modernization is one of the other big topics. So I do want to make sure that we hold some time for not only what Brian has described, which is it's very real. Our board, I think every time they have seen one of these, really wants to understand the cost benefit. And so trying to help, and they asked specifically, like, what does that mean in terms of water that we actually will see in stream? So there's that piece. And I think just ensuring not to, because what we don't want to do is somehow challenge those types of projects from coming through. I think we just want to make sure we're as clear as possible in what we ask of applicants and the evaluation criteria we apply. I think on the other hand, and I believe it was at the last RAC meeting, there was a little bit of discussion around, can we actually require something above and beyond the percent going in stream from what WRD does? Like, they have their formula, and the more the better. We heard from a few of you. So I want to make sure we have some time for this conversation of the board asks hard questions about these things and we need to be able to answer them and be transparent with applicants. And do we need to be mindful about getting as much as absolutely possible? So Anton, go for it.
Thanks, Renee. Yeah, my comment question was sort of in that vein. And Corey, forgive me, I should know this by now. So it's 25% minimum, right? But then it's proportional to the amount of public dollars above and beyond that. Is that right? Is that what OWRD's formula is for the state's portion?
Yeah, that's correct.
And so, yeah, are we saying we want to see at least that, but ideally more? I guess there is some subjectivity here still to what we're asking for. And if we want to ask for those things, maybe it would be helpful to use the specific terminology in the ACW program and call out the formula that's used. Just an idea.
All right, go ahead, Spencer.
Kind of along those same lines, the priority date issue, I'd be interested in folks' opinion on that. Whether or not the conserved portion retains the original priority date or is 1 minute junior or whatever it is. I'd be curious if folks think we need to spell that out here or just thoughts in general on that.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer, for flagging that, because this is one where we don't know exactly where to put it. We did hear that there was interest in that, and we're not. Yeah, we could do that maybe as a condition of the grant agreement. I can't remember what section that would be, but if it would help to be as transparent as possible and put it here so that folks know, we're open to that too, if you all think that's important to do. Jessica, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had two things. A quick follow-up for Corey. On the proportional cost or proportion in stream relative to the public dollars contributing to the project, isn't it also that even if 100% was paid for by public dollars, the applicant can receive no less than 25% of the conserved water in stream? So
that is
the state
yeah,
could
that's
pay for
correct.
100% and then, but only 75% would technically have to go in stream. The applicant could say they want to do 98% in stream, or is that right?
That is correct. Yeah, in any case, shall the applicant get no less than 25% unless they're feeling absolutely generous.
Yeah, and we've utilized that in past conserved water projects, not funded by OWEB, but through OWRD, where the applicant has, retained like 4% to utilize elsewhere, but, contributed a higher amount to make the in-stream benefit higher. Or we've utilized that a couple of times, and it could be interesting to explore here whether it's worth explicitly requiring that or encouraging it in some way. But in response to what Spencer mentioned about the priority date, I don't know exactly where it would be appropriate to address, but I would be very supportive of us explicitly saying that the conserved water portion maintain the original priority date equal with the on-farm portion.
Okay, so I think, go ahead, Corey.
I've had discussions on both issues, the priority date. Through my program, they have that choice of making the in-stream portion 1 minute junior or keeping it the same as their existing use. We really don't have any issue if that is part of the application evaluation criteria that, hey, if you want to get funds from OWEB, you need to choose the same priority date. We don't have an issue with that. And we don't have an issue with, if you're using funds from OWEB, 100% goes in stream. We don't have an issue with that. However, I do have a slight concern on that, because one reason some folks choose to use the allocation conserve water program is because one of the options of the applicant's portion of conserved water is that you can put it on new lands. And we all know that it's becoming increasingly difficult, almost non-existent really, to even get a new water right. And so if somebody has a piece of land that they want to irrigate and it doesn't have a water right, I've had folks in the past go through the ACW program, modernize their irrigation system just so they can get a little bit of water to put on a new piece of land that does not have a water right. So if we're telling folks that you want to use OWEB funds, 100% needs to go in stream, then we're kind of taking that flexibility away, and one of the reasons behind the ACW program away. But we don't really, if that's what OWEB wants to do, then we don't have any issue with it. That's my little bit of concern.
Yep. Thanks for that, Corey. Anton, and then Steve.
Thank you. Yeah, no, share those same concerns with Corey. I think it's an important inducement for folks to use this program, that they are able to spread some of that water elsewhere. So, and I think we heard in Astoria from the board that there was already this sort of misperception of the ACW program and that ability. So I wouldn't want us to curtail that formally here. I think that might be counterproductive for what we're trying to do. Maybe we can put in here that if greater than the required proportion goes in stream, those projects will be rated more highly. Maybe that's something we can include here. I will say, we feel very strongly that the priority date should be the same. It should not be subordinated. If you want to go through the ACW program and get the benefits from that, and there are lots of benefits to the water user, and you want to subordinate the state's portion, well, then that's fine. But I think it shouldn't be public funds going to that. So we are very much in support of including that provision here, that the priority date needs to stay the same. Thanks.
Thanks, Anton. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, on both those points, the percent in stream, I feel like there's the Water Resource Department's formula based on public funding. But outside of that, it's open to negotiation between, the buyer and the seller. If TU can work out agreement where the landowner puts 100% in stream, great, So I think they should have the flexibility to make those deals, and on the priority date, yeah, I guess I feel kind of the same way, I would largely leave that to the people making the deals. The landowner may not want to make a deal where you share the priority date. Maybe he wants to be a minute senior to the in-stream portion. But again, that's kind of what's the situation on the ground, what's the regulation on the stream, and does it matter whether you're a minute junior or a minute senior? So I guess I would kind of leave that up to the water transaction people to figure out what's the best way to achieve the seniority on the stream they're looking for. And in some cases, frankly, they may want to be a minute senior to the existing water right, and the existing water right holder could make their water right a minute junior as a result of the allocation of conserved water process too. Maybe it's never happened, but it's possible. They would just simply need to tell Water Resource Department to subjugate us to the in-stream portion of this water right, or subjugate's maybe not the right word, but so I think the matter of priority, I kind of think should be left to the people making the transactions and the percent in stream. But you're you're definitely beholden to the calculation that Water Resource Department has there in the program.
Thanks, Steve. Anton?
One other consideration on the 1 minute subordination, it also creates a new priority date that OWD has to manage. And that's been a real headache in the wall in particular, where we've had hundreds of water rights affected by ACW projects, some of which have had the state's portion subordinated by 1 minute. And so it's really created a lot of administrative burden for OWRD in trying to manage up there. So just one other consideration is a little bit different. I do, Steve, yeah, recognize that argument that we're potentially taking away a negotiating item, but we really see that becoming an issue when we're working with priority dates that are right on the edge of reliability. You know, if they subordinate that water right, we don't get the value from it. So again, that's just our experience here. I'm sure it could be different elsewhere, but I did want to raise that issue about the administrative burden where could inadvertently be creating for OWRD by creating yet another priority date.
Yeah, thanks for that, Anton. So I'm going to test what I think I've heard here, which is there seems to be a fair amount of support for the concept of creating openness for project developer to work with a water right holder to go above and beyond to whatever that percentage is relative to the WRD formula, and that maybe the way we address this is either through a preference or through a requirement, recognizing that the more requirements mean that does remove some flexibility in negotiation for our applicant organization. So any opinion on we could denote an evaluation criteria giving some preference to those that work to maximize the amount of water going in stream, but without making it a hard requirement that I don't want to unintentionally hamstring our local partners without thought. Spencer, go ahead.
Yeah, my preference would be to go the preference route over the requirement to allow that flexibility. And I also would hope that there'd be an implication on the cost benefit analysis, depending on the percent put in stream. It's going to show there how much CFS you're getting or acre feet per dollar. And that's going to vary significantly whether or not they're going with 25% in stream or 100%. But I like, to Steve's point, I think allowing the project manager and the landowner to have that flexibility is critical for getting some projects across the finish line.
Any heartburn with that?
That's how I feel. Sorry, I should qualify that.
Okay.
That's how I feel when it comes to the percentage. I believe that the priority date should not be subordinated and they should be consistent.
Okay, thanks for that. So Kate, concern about the percent, the preference on percent?
Strong preference for priority date. Sorry to avoid your question. But yeah, I mean, in the Deschutes, the in-stream benefit plummets. And if that's what this grant program is trying to actually work towards, versus like Stevie said, the OWRD program is geared towards multiple benefits. And if this is in-stream benefit, you're not going to get that same in-stream benefit. So, and if it doesn't show up in the requirements, then the evaluation needs to be really clear on what that means from what shows up in stream in that system.
Okay. Let's see, that's Kate's hand. So for Kaylin, go ahead.
I feel like the new number 2 that has been inserted in here can really help the review team gauge how a particular proposal either knocks it out of the park or doesn't. And it's particularly that seniority question that is tagged in that sub 2. And that gets to your 1 minute junior or your equivalent priority dates for your ACW. And I wonder, I mean, it's so much of like reliability and seniority are around how does this particular water interest live within the ecosystem of the other water rights on that system. And I almost wonder if that kind of needs to be said out loud somehow. Especially for like, you know, when the board sees these, they don't see them that often. And this stuff is complicated. And really what we're trying to accomplish here is improve, like real improvements in stream flow that are going to generate benefits for Oregon's native fish and wildlife. And if you can drive home that that really depends on how this particular water project either like sinks or swims amongst the other water rights, you know, upstream and downstream of it. And maybe it already does that with reliability and seniority. But it was occurring to me that number 2 really tees up well the review process and being able to describe how this particular project will result in improvements and benefits.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. Keep in mind that we also have guidance and application questions that really do aim to ensure that folks are contextualizing. Whether they fully take advantage of the opportunity in the grant application to do that is a different thing. But I think thinking through, is there something else we can do on that here, and making sure we follow through on really pointing folks to, you do have to explain the ecosystem of water rights and what it means, and some of the other materials. I don't think we've resolved. I want to check, and knowing that this isn't an official vote, but I think I've heard some advocating for leave the flexibility around 1 minute same priority date or 1 minute junior. So that would be more of a preference, but I think I've also heard some advocating for, no, you need to have a hard statement of requirement. So where are folks, I guess, and maybe raise your hand, how many folks are feeling like, yeah, preference is enough in the review process versus a hard requirement? So who votes for preference? All right. Does that mean all of you vote for requirement? Okay. Steve?
Well, despite my previous comment, in reviewing some of the grant applications, I've always been disappointed when I finally get to the part of the application where it talks about priority, and it was 1 minute prior, 1 minute junior. And I thought, oh, this would have been a great project if it had shared the priority date, because it could matter at some point in the summer in terms of regulation, whether the in-stream right gets fulfilled or not. So I would, and for the purposes of OWEB, I would probably be in the camp of make it a requirement that it's the same priority date.
Okay. Anton?
I appreciate everyone's thoughtful reflection on this, and I can assure you, your water masters will thank you too, as we've thought through distribution lists and how we actually start regulating for in-stream water rights, particularly up in the wall in the last couple of years. This will make water masters' lives a lot easier to not have that additional priority date to have to deal with. So I think that is a good argument in and of itself to take this course of action. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. I do want to flag, I don't think we have April on any longer. So recognizing that April might have some additional thoughts about this topic, but Brian and I will circle back with both April and Shyla, who aren't here. Okay, so Brian and Eric Hartstein, I've done a fairly abysmal job of time management since we're just now getting into the new content. So Eric, I want to have a time check on, we do need to hold a little bit of time at the end to talk about next steps with subsequent meetings. I feel as though we should probably at some point offer another public comment period, but Hartstein, thoughts about timing of that?
Yeah, what about you got 3:45 public comment?
Okay.
And then having a few minutes at the end for steps.
Okay, that sounds great. So Brian, do you want to pick us up after evaluation criteria? And thanks everyone for the great conversation.
Yeah, that was a great discussion. And there is one final added line in the criteria where for evaluation criteria, looking at is the project implementing actions identified by collaborative basin planning efforts or actions in the state integrated water resources strategy or other state, federal, or tribal plan to protect and restore in-stream values. And so that was just one additional criteria that the technical review team could consider and an applicant could consider, just pointing that out, and didn't know if you all felt like that was an important enough issue to add to the evaluation criteria. And I'm not seeing any hands raised. I would like to know, is that because people are okay with that being added in?
So thumbs up if you're okay with it,
Yeah.
and if not, please share your thoughts.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So a couple thumbs up, 3. Okay. Then now I think that takes us to the end of the evaluation criteria updates, and then moving into the next section, the application evaluation process. And here there was we are choosing to remove a section that refers to policy issue or budget issue that needs to be addressed by the board prior to a funding decision. There isn't a need to have that in there. And then we also modified how we refer to ranking the order of all projects. And then at the end of that section is where there's that added in section to talk about creating operational efficiencies or complementary investments with other funders. So any concerns or questions or comments on that section for application evaluation process? Kayla?
Thanks, Brian. I'm curious if the rewrite around rank ordering means that that there could be situations where you don't have rank orders and where you're forwarding the list and it just has the proposals that have been reviewed. And I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a board member who's like, okay, we've got 10 projects and we've got enough money for 5 of them, and it really would be helpful if these were ranked. But this seems to make it such that you don't have to rank them anymore. Am I reading that right?
So I can tell you the examples of when we have had a project that's recommended for funding. So we only had 2 projects come in a grant cycle. One was recommended for funding. One was not recommended for funding by the review team. We did not do a ranking because there was nothing to rank. There was one project and it was 1. We also early in the allocation of the $10 million in general fund that transitioned to other funds. There was enough money that we actually weren't doing rankings. Certainly when we have to draw a funding line, a ranking needs to happen. And I don't think, unless Brian or Eric Hartstein tell me otherwise, I don't think we feel incredibly strongly about this. It was being clear that in some situations a ranking may not make sense. But this is not a deal breaker for us. We also can keep in rank order unless Brian or Eric tells me that we will then be inconsistent with other rule sets.
No, I think, if we wanted to replace may with shall, is that what we're talking about here? Then that'd be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Kaylin, does that help?
Yeah, and I mean, I know there's just an ick factor to ranking. And if you're the board and either you are faced with a funding constraint or you decide to hold back funding of your own accord because you can, because you're the board, it would be helpful, I think, to have a requirement for ranking. And Renee, to your point around sometimes there's only one project, like then the ranking's really easy. You just put a 1 next to it, right?
Right, so we'll huddle about this because what we don't want to do is have anyone feel as though the process isn't clear or we're kind of hiding the ball and where they were in the slate. Yep. Okay. Thanks for that feedback, Kaylin.
Okay, so that gets us through that section, and then we're on to the staff funding recommendation process, section 0201. And here there was just some adjustments made that it's not necessary to have that language in there anymore. And then we're on to section 0202 funding decision. And here there were some discussion topics around community impacts that I think I'll turn it over to Renee to set that up.
Yeah, and those who, well, Eric Hartstein and those who are on the last rack may remember some of this too. So we deleted some of the rule content that described expectations for community. It described things like potential effects on existing water rights, other relevant socioeconomic information, current and proposed water uses to try to better describe what do we mean by community benefits and impacts, so both positive and negative. There were some edits made, and yet we retained this clause around after considering recommendations from staff and any community impacts from the proposed water acquisition project. So in some ways, and we bumped into something akin to this, but not exactly, with our land acquisition grant program a couple years ago, we're almost signaling an additional criterion, not in the evaluation criteria section. And so I want to make sure that we talk through if there is something important here to consider around community benefits and impacts, then it's important enough to be part of the evaluation. We capture that in the criteria rather than having this thing that may result in a confusing discussion or overlay very late in the game. So Anton, go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess my first question is there a requirement to have this consideration in there? I don't think that there is. And assuming there isn't, I just worry that that's going to set us up for something like the land acquisition struggles we've had. if we're following the law and we have a willing seller, then shouldn't that be good enough? So I guess, yeah, my question is, are we obligated to do any more? And if not, well, boy, I would be really leery of having language like that in there.
So Eric Hartstein, and you may know this, and if not, one of us can do this on the fly. I know that there is something akin to this, not exactly the same, in land acquisition, which we have flagged as being problematic, and we're not yet in rulemaking. Is there anything akin to community benefit or impact in any of the other rule sets, like restoration as an example?
I'd have to go back, go back and look. There's a lot of evaluation criteria in our restoration rules. But I believe there is something around impacts to neighboring properties. But I have to go back and double check on that. I will note that the climate rules do have an evaluation criterion around engagement with those impacted communities, which oftentimes can mean landowners and surrounding communities with the project.
Okay, thanks for that. And we do have a separate section, and I can't remember if it's titled public notification, public involvement. So there are also a set of things that we do. One of those needs to be cleaned up, but we also do extensive notification on all of our transaction programs. So I want to flag that piece too. Jessica and then Anton.
Yeah, I think that's part of what I wanted to clarify. Like the community impacts is pretty broad. Is this relative to public comment that's received about a particular project? Like after considering staff recommendations and any public comment that's been presented specific to that project, like that seems a relevant thing for them to consider, but just generally any potential community impacts does feel like we're really opening ourselves up to just anything could be thrown in there.
Yep.
To throw a wrench in the review process.
And I do think that's where the retention of this, when we lost some of those other definitions, makes it more confusing. So my interpretation would be, yes, if we have public comment, that is where something like this would come in. But absent a definition, you're right. It's confusing. Anton?
Yeah, certainly outreach, engagement, all those things are critically important. But in monitoring some of the, again, maybe apples and oranges a little bit, but monitoring some of the public hearings on land acquisition stuff recently, you have a couple vociferous locals who just don't like it. I'm sorry, but they're not, being legally infringed upon in any way. So I don't like a lot of things. I have to deal with them also. So I worry about having that sort of carte blanche here. Because I don't think that's the intent. Obviously, we want to be responsive and open to what the community thinks, but I don't think that should hold up a legal project with a willing seller. Sorry, I know you've heard this all before from me, though.
Appreciate hearing it in this context. And nothing about this changes that if any of these projects do have an interface with WRD administrative processes, that will include the injury review. So I want to flag that piece too. Okay, so Brian and I think Eric Hartstein, let's spend a little bit of time trying to clean this up so we're really clear on where this reference should live and what it is. Okay. I think, Brian, I'll turn it back to you unless Kaylin, go ahead.
Well, I can't remember who flagged, it may have been Jessica, that, is the community impacts maybe better as any public comment? Because I don't actually see in here that the board has to, or the director has to consider public comments in making a decision. And the next section talks about public involvement and that the board will accept it. But then just to be, I don't know, blunt here, it doesn't say that the director or the board has to consider them. I agree to, like, the cleanup regarding the community impact seems like it's a relic of something that might have been intended to be taken out the last time around.
Yeah, it's a good catch. Knowing how we operate culturally, the board absolutely hears public comment on both. I mean, they pay attention to written comment and certainly hear verbal comment, and I mean absorb that. And so Eric Hartstein, let's connect about, we know how this works functionally, and I know that if I make a change here, it could perpetuate through other rule sets. So let's huddle on that one. But thanks for that catch, Kaylin. I hadn't read it in that way. Okay, we are actually 1 minute past, I just realized. So let's pause here. Folks, I promise you we're going to get to the end of this rule set eventually. So Eric, can I turn it back to you for navigating public comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. So if there is additional public comment at this time, please raise your virtual hand. Ken, go ahead when you are unmuted.
Thank you. My only comment is something I emailed to Kate. There's I misrepresented on section 4, my recommended language. It should be both. Instead of or, it should be and in the third line. So it's both a restricted groundwater area and show a direct and demonstrable impact on groundwater dependent ecosystems. Sorry about the or, it should be and. That's it. I really appreciate the thoughtful comments from all of the board, the RAC members. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Appreciate the clarification. Any other public comments at this point? And not seeing any hands, I'll go back to you, Renee, for wrap up.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks, Ken, for that clarification. Super helpful. So we really are close to the end. I think we'll move pretty quickly through many of these because they are more kind of mechanics of our grant making. So we will need to preserve some time to get to the end. At the next meeting, we also will be bringing back some follow-ups on substantive topics. I think honestly, part of our work before the next meeting, I guess I'm flagging this for Brian and Eric and Taylor, is some internal discussion on, I think Ken did a great job of framing up. There's the eligibility question, and then there's the how you would contemplate this from a groundwater perspective. And I want to make sure we're having those discussions internally and figuring out how we have some transparency for the board, because this is an important topic as part of this rulemaking. So I am going to be very optimistic and say, hopefully we can get this done in 4 meetings. And I do think after this discussion, we may need to preserve the option of a 5th meeting to wrap things up, because we do at that last meeting need to at least spend a bit of time walking through. Eric Hartstein, help me to remember what that analysis is, the economic and business impact analysis.
Yeah, we need to do basically a relatively quick fiscal impact with these rules. I think it'll be relatively quick. I don't want to assume anything, and also a racial equity analysis too.
Okay. So I'm going to thank you in advance for your patience. In the event that we need to go into a fifth meeting, it will depend on how things go next time. I know that I think Brian, you have a doodle out.
Yeah, there's a doodle poll out now. I appreciate everyone that's already contributed when they're available for our fourth meeting. I've heard back from a little over half of you.
And recognizing that we are now at the 15th of January and short session begins in early February. So I know that could be an impact to some folks' schedules. So we'll try to, again, maximize the number of RAC members we can have at meetings 4 and 5 if needed. I think our drop dead, we must have our RAC meetings wrapped up by mid-April. I can assure you we will be wrapped up well before then, even if we need to have a fifth meeting, but that will put us on track to do the necessary filing with Secretary of State, 28-day public comment to have revised rules for consideration by the board at our July meeting. Eric Hartstein, anything else we should flag for the RAC members around process from here?
I can't think of anything. I think you got it.
Okay. So thanks to all of you. You're a joy to work with, and we're so happy and thankful to have this brain trust. We only open rules typically every 5 years. There are some really big and important topics. I don't want to give short shrift to those. So thanks for your commitment to walking down this road with us. We truly could not do it without you. So anything else for the good of the order?
Thanks, OWEB.
Thank you all.
Yeah, good job.
Thanks,
Webb. Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Meg.
Of course.
Thanks,
I'm going to
Meg.
stop the recording now.